Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay, and you are listening to another exciting episode of the new Discourses podcast. And we are still doing this kind of secondary mini-series, I don't know how long of a series this will be, where we're exploring Nazi ideology, and we're doing the Myth of the Blood series, which explores Alfred Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, which is a really interesting book written about the core Nazi ideology and mythology, published in 1930. So just for the historical reference, Mein Kampf is published in 1925. This is published in 1930. Hitler takes power in 1933. World War II starts in 1939. So you can kind of have a timeline. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, starts in 1920. And so you kind of have this picture of this timeline of when this comes in. So Alfred Rosenberg, to remind you, dear listener, is the chief ideologist of the Third Reich. It is his job to write down what Nazis believe, or what they are going to believe. Now, the interesting, curious part of this story is it's your average Nazi who was a German worker didn't believe any of this, or very little of it. They thought it was a bit ridiculous, at least to believe Melita Maschmann, who was a teenager who had joined the girls' version of the Hitler Youth, which was what's it called? The Bund Deutsche Model or something like that. And so she had joined this group and was a Hitler Youth, and she talks in her diary about her experience as a Hitler Youth that most of her peers, at least, and most of the people she knew, didn't believe any of this. But the Nazi elite did believe it. This book was considered the second most important book in the Third Reich after Mein Kampf. Now, to say that doesn't quite tell the whole story, because Mein Kampf is famously ranty and difficult to read. If you're listening to the Nazi Experiment podcast series, you've heard that. You know that. Hitler is not the most engaging writer in the world. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, did not think very highly of Hitler's ranting either. So the chances are high that this book, while considered second in importance, second in sales and distribution to Mein Kampf in the Nazi regime, was the most engaged. I don't know how much it was read. It's a very long book. It's a very bizarre book if you've been following along. Now, I'm taking a particularly interesting tack with this book. I'm reading a lot of it. We're going to cover a lot of it. It gets crazier the further in you go, at least through the first part. The book is broken into several different parts, not just chapters. The first 3 chapters are the first part, and boy, oh boy, do they get crazier as they go. But the tack I'm trying to take with this telling of the myth of the 20th century, and that myth's name is the Myth of the Blood, is in fact that what we have is a very unique and interesting period of time that's causing the Nazis to grasp for something like this. And this isn't to apologize for the Nazis. I know that we've got these right-wing nut job apologists, Nazi apologists out there trying to tell the story of the Germans from the German perspective to humanize them. I don't think that that's productive or fair, but it is, I think, useful to figure out what was going on that led to the Nazi experiment in the first place. And that's really what this Myth of the Blood series is trying to get at underneath the text. And what I'm seeing is, and what I've talked about in this series so far, is that the emergence of, or the maturation of the natural sciences in the late 19th century going into the 20th century has badly displaced the old kinds of narratives, or as the postmodernists would phrase it, the old meta-narratives that European regimes relied upon. And then we have this cataclysm of World War I, this war that doesn't make sense, this circumstance that spiraled out of control to the most brutal and awful thing that had ever happened, shocking the psyche and the conscience of Europeans and people around the world. Nobody knows quite why or how this thing came about. It was a very complicated situation. The more I look into the circumstances that led to and developed in World War I, the more confusing it is. And I think that's very common for World War I scholars, not that I am one of those. But World War I shocked these people. So here we have the disillusion of the ability to believe the old stories people told about themselves, as the sciences mature, as new waves of mysticism come flooding in from the colonies. Not that there's always been a deep current of mysticism in Germany. And in fact, later in this book, you're going to hear, not just Germany, Europe. But in this book later, in the 3rd chapter, we'll be there in a couple of episodes of the series, you're going to hear just how deeply old German mysticism, dating back over 600 years, informed the Nazi ideology. We're going to hear, we already know that Hegel and Marx and so on were somewhat, especially Hegel, were derivative to the German mystic Jakob Boehme. And it turns out that the Nazis are derivative not directly to Jakob Boehme himself, but rather to the mystic who actually started the school of mysticism and thought in Germany, in which Jakob Boehme was a player. And that's the infamous Meister Eckhart. We'll hear about that later, just to kind of preview. So here we are. New mythologies are flooding in. The old stories are no longer tenable. Science is displacing and maturing, but not mature. So you have all these mystical views coming from India, from Africa. You have all these new ideas flooding in, a lot of mysticism, a lot of charlatanry. And then you have the sciences displacing the old stories, and the science is trying to tell new stories about what's possible, especially with regard to human development and evolution. And that's where a lot of the eugenics ends up coming in. And then what you have is this cataclysm of World War I, shocking people out of their sense of selves, shocking them out of the old beliefs, the old world that they took for granted and built their psyches and their societies upon, shocking them out of that. Not just the cataclysms of Marxism and communism and the French Revolution, but the cataclysm of the First World War, which broke the European psyche, and they're now searching for a new way to grasp the world. The old ways that they were grasping the world were eroding, and they failed. That's the way that World War I got interpreted, at least by the Germans. And a new way with much more firmness and concreteness to it has to fill the gap. And what's filling the gap is the myth of the blood, this pseudo-scientific, pseudo-evolutionary philosophy where races are the determinative object of humanity. Races are what make people have their character. Values, character itself are determined racially. So a person that is, derivative to the Nordic races, as they have in the myth of the blood, the Nordic German or Europeans, for example, have fundamentally different values, fundamentally different character as a result of their breed or their race from, say, somebody in the Levant or in the Middle East or in India or in Africa or in China. Fundamentally different values pervade because values are a matter of blood, of race, that race is the determinative issue of human character. No universalism. We're now going to latch onto this. And this is given as the explanation for why World War I occurred and why Germany lost World War I. So you have this pseudo-scientific, quasi-mystical kind of, milieu growing up around Europe at the turn of the 20th century, and you have the cataclysm of a world war that nobody understands, shocking people out and making them desperate to find a new explanation. And the Nazi mythology offered exactly that. Now, that was a very long introduction, but I don't think we can understand this second chapter. I've done 3 podcasts actually on this book so far. It is volume 13 of the Nazi Experiment podcast, and then 2 dedicated Myth of the Blood podcasts going through parts of chapter 1. Now we're turning to chapter 2, which is titled Love and Honor, and it is not possible to understand Love and Honor, chapter 2, without understanding that we just talked about, this background philosophy of why this is happening, what it's accomplishing, and this kind of clinging to a self-gratifying pseudoscientific racialist mindset. And in particular, we can't understand what's being said in this core Nazi mythology, this core Nazi belief system, this core Nazi explanation for how the world became what it was, without understanding that values and character are racial characteristics. So the race determines the character. That's incredibly important. That means a black person can never be the same in values and character, or a Jew can never be the same in values and character, or a Chinese can never be the same in values and character to a Nordic European Aryan. They are fundamentally different at the core level of the values produced by their blood. And that's what we covered in the previous episodes when we actually explored the myth of the blood itself, this pseudoscientific structure that informed the Nazi psyche. So now we turn to this second chapter, which is titled Love and Honor. That's an interesting title for a chapter, and what is happening in this chapter is that Alfred Rosenberg, the chief ideologist of the Third Reich, is developing two primary value systems, love and honor, two core central values upon which the world, the psychological and sociological world are going to be built for people. Okay, so we're going to have an entirely new way of thinking, and it's going to be based on one or the other of two core values, love or honor. As you can imagine, the Germans are the honor people and everybody else are the love people, and therefore honor is strong, love is weak. These two contrasting highest human values are in play. So this is a comparison and contrast chapter. It's not that people need to cultivate love and honor. It's not that love and honor are both good things. It's in fact that love is bad as a foundation for our societies, and honor is good. Now, I'm not going to do this in this episode, but I'm going to do a second episode in this chapter soon that I don't know what to call it yet, but the working title is Alfred Rosenberg Hates Catholics. Most of this chapter is dedicated to just absolutely trashing Catholics for Alfred Rosenberg's Nazi belief that Catholics were, in fact, the ideology that undermined and ruined Europe by bringing in this idea of universal love and, in fact, not even practicing it themselves. So this is a very long chapter. It's over 70 pages long. A full 3/4 of this chapter are railing on Catholics in ways that the new atheists barely could have imagined. We could really title the next episode, Rosenberg Really Hates Catholics, or Nazis Really Hate Catholics, or something like that. And like I said, the reason is that he blames the Catholics along with other groups, but largely the Catholics, for having injected and enforced an alien worldview system based on universal love into Europe, which undermined the Germanic, Nordic, or Aryan focus on honor that made it all work. And it's very important, all that preamble that I gave is very important to understand this love and honor thing, because love and honor are high values. High values are extensions of race. So to force a German or a Nordic or a European or an Aryan to be Christian, or to be Catholic especially, is to suppress who he fundamentally is. And so the story that he's telling about Europe is that Europe burst forth into periods of progress when the European, Nordic, Aryan, German, whatever you want, character broke free for a moment of this conditioning from primarily the Roman Catholic Church, which was made on different values sourced in Syria, in the Levant, and in Africa that are not becoming of Nordic, Aryan, European values, which are rooted in honor, freedom, loyalty, and duty. So honor with loyalty, freedom, and duty are Nordic, German, and Aryan. Love is the invitation to the destruction of your race. That's the comparison that he's actually giving. And then he talks about three vehicles by which love poisons the society. Okay. And let me just clarify before I get into it. Well, what they are is Roman Catholic approaches, which is basically based on charity, pity, and universalism. This idea that man is created in the image of God, rather than that each race has its own characteristic, so that all men are equal image bearers of God and equal dignity, equal claim to justice. The Nazis reject that. Nope, the Aryans are fundamentally different, fundamentally better, fundamentally have higher values because of their race, and are fundamentally, therefore, not the same thing. And this they see as a lie. This idea of being made in imago Dei is a lie that has to be overcome because it has ruined the racial stock of Europe. Now, when we talk about that's one of the three forms. The other two are Freemasonry, brings in humanitarianism, which is also associated with Jewish thinking. Jews also bring in this idea of universal humanitarianism, also the Imago Dei, but he links Jews and Freemasons as being caught up in a humanitarian, materialistic kind of ideology. And then he blames the Russians for the third impulse to love, which is rooted in sympathy. So universalism, sympathy, pity, charity, humanitarianism are all considered vigorously bad invitations to undermine and destroy your race. Jewish materialism denies the racial soul part of the equation and therefore also poisons your race, but it's very tangential to this. Love is soft, love is weak, love dissolves a man's willingness to bind himself with honor and duty, and therefore to ultimately dissolve his race. Love is not something people will sacrifice for. Love is something that cannot build. You don't build for love, you build for pride. So you have this idea of pride being a driving motive, and pride being tied to honor is why you're willing to sacrifice. He's very explicit and says that no one would be willing to make a sacrifice of any scale for love. You have to do that for honor or for duty or for freedom, because you know you're supposed to, because you know it weighs in on your evaluation of self and others, your psychosocial evaluation, or because it limits your freedom to be who you will. And that brings me back to this idea of freedom as a high value of the Nordic, according to Rosenberg. It's not freedom the way we think of it. It's not freedom to be an individual. It's not freedom to believe as you will. It's not freedom to choose as you will. You are bound by duty and bound by honor. It is a kind of inner freedom that comes from doing your duty and your honor because you believe that you're choosing to. It is the individual responsibility to live your own life in duty to the collective in which you're a part. And that collective is defined by the blood or by race or by breed, if you want, of human. So the duty then replaces individual responsibility with duty to the state, duty to the race, duty to the folk. So you have your honor tied up with your obligation to be dutiful to the race and to the folk and to the state that represents it. And individual responsibility is only to manifest yourself, to fully express yourself through the obligation to the state that you have. So this isn't freedom to do as you will, it is freedom to be a nationalist participant in the state project. Remember that fascism of both or all types is ultimately idolatry of the state. And we will hear that more and more as we go. But this is the comparison, this form of duty and honor, which is supposed to be strong and building and sacrificial and so on, is how humans build great cultures, and it's tied up with the Aryan racial characteristic. And love or pity or sympathy or charity or humanitarianism are all expressions of the same fundamental weakness that eventually cause you to be willing to be too universal, too willing to value the lesser, and ultimately to miscegenate and mix your race or mix your blood, and therefore ruin everything. One more time before we turn to the text. The context here is that the cataclysm of World War I was almost impossible for these people to reckon with, so they're dying for an explanation of who they are in the world and what they can do. So even beyond the loss of all their heroic champions and warriors and fighters, the best blood as it was referred to in the Nazi canon, beyond that, there's also the loss of psyche. They lose sense of who they are. They don't know what this was about, and they can't fathom how they lost if they're part of the Central Powers, or especially Germany. They can't bear the humiliation of having been at the center and being blamed for this war that nobody understands and being put under heavy sanctions and limitations by things like the Treaty of Versailles. This war, World War I, was regarded by very many, even while it was being fought, but certainly in its aftermath. It ends in 1918, by the way. This war was regarded very widely as having been almost completely pointless. Nobody understood why it happened. It just was a whole lot of international tensions between different European powers and weird alliances where one assassination in Prague sets off a chain reaction where now we have a literal global war of mechanized destruction beyond the capacities of anybody to understand. It is just this very strange story where the old world order fundamentally collapsed and revealed itself to be a calamity. And so in the wake of all this destruction, so many people had no idea what the hell happened and who the hell they are and how the hell they're going to go forward. And this myth of the blood was a Nazi attempt. So we talk about the Nazi experiment. At the core of the Nazi experiment was an attempt to redefine the human psyche for the European man, or particularly for the German European, who identifies himself as this Nordic, Aryan Superman. And this is an attempt for them to recover psyche in a very deep way. Rosenberg is in some sense using this particular chapter, but this myth overall, to diagnose World War I's outcome, not as a failure of German arms or capability or courage or strength or power or virtue, but rather as the culmination of a centuries-long spiritual struggle in which alien ideas, alien values like love, forced in by the Catholic Church, had eroded the Nordic racial soul and its natural attachment to duty and honor, thus weakening the people, thus causing this historic loss. So his solution, Rosenberg's answer to that problem, is a new but ancient, it's that pseudo-traditional thing we've talked about in the previous episodes, a pseudo-traditional, new but ancient mythical order centered on blood, race, and heroic duty to the blood and the race, or the folk, if you want. So this was supposed to be precisely the kind of ideology that was going to be offered to a generation of disillusioned veterans, disillusioned youth who felt that the old world had betrayed them and their sacrifices. There's your red alarm about why we want to talk about this now, because we're going through something similar. Again, history is not repeating, but rhyming. We have a lot of veterans. We have a lot of young people who are at this point in time wondering what it's all been for up to this point. The world has rapidly changed. We've been put under attack by the woke. We have all of this mass immigration, mass shifting, this globalization, and all of this stuff that people thought they could take for granted falling out from underneath them. And what was it all for? We have this same kind of societal anomie or drift occurring right now. And the Nazis proposed an answer. The Nazis came up with this crazy new ideology answering the question, in essence, what is a German? And of course, we see in parallel people asking, what is an American? And trying to answer that question in some new way in order to regain their sense of psyche and to do something in the world. So this is history rhyming. This is why this is so important for us to understand. And what we have is what we see in this book and this ideology and this myth of the blood and this explanation of love versus honor is very classic Central European, or especially German, radical right-wing thinking that the war actually was not meaningless. This wasn't just a whole bunch of kind of stupid alliances that blew out of proportion and ended up costing, 10% of the best people in literally the known world. It's in fact that it was a very important and meaningful situation whose meaning was stolen by having been inculcated into the wrong value systems. So now we're going to restore German dignity by restoring honor as the chief value over the love that had weakened it in the past. And thus there will be the prevention of future defeats and a rise of glory and success going forward. So that's the point of this exploration, of this chapter, of this particular reading that I'm going to give today, partly reading from Chapter 2, Love and Honor, from Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, published in 1930, second most influential book in the Nazi regime. Widely believed by the Nazi elite, not widely accepted by the Nazi public. But the goal was, of course, to get them. This is the religion that was supposed to replace Christianity. I'm not going to cover it in this episode, but the last section of this chapter makes that extremely clear, that there's going to be a new Germanic positive Christianity that's going to replace this love-oriented Christianity for the Catholics and the Protestants that has ruined Germany up to this point. So in this chapter, he takes aim at the Catholics. We'll cover that next time. In the next chapter, he takes aim at the Protestants, and we'll cover that afterwards. So let's begin. Let's read some Alfred Rosenberg, Myth of the Blood, Chapter 2, Love and Honor. During the last 1900 years, this being written in 1930, so now we're going back to the death of Christ. During the last 1900 years, many wars have borne the stamp of religion. in most cases justifiably, yet not always so. So in other words, yeah, most of the time there's a lot of wars, they got blamed on religion, and a lot of the time religion started them or was the cause. But it wasn't always the case. He says, the very fact that struggles of extermination would be carried out at all for a religious conviction shows to what degree the Teutonic peoples, that's our Germanic Aryans, by the way, our Nordics, the Teutonic peoples had been successfully alienated from their original character. Let me draw you to the James Lindsay moment of the podcast, although we'll have a few of those. Alienated from their original character. This is what I have been saying all along makes them woke. Why are the Nazis woke? Because they believe that they've been alienated from who they really are and the birthright that comes with being who they really are. Just like the communists feel like they were alienated from their birthright as socialists to live in a socialist utopia by the introduction of private property and the securing of private property rights, and thus they're alienated by the power structure erected by the property owners, the bourgeoisie, if you go to classical Marxism. Here we have the belief that people are alienated from the race and the racial values that were their inheritance that would have made them great. So humanity would be great as socialists to the Marxists, and humanity would be great as Aryans, as Aryan racial folk for the Nazis. And the goal becomes to seize the means of the production of the characteristic that makes people who they are. So the Nazis are seizing the means of racial production in the same way that communists are seizing the means of economic production. And you get the flavor of that here. The very fact that there would be religious wars at all, he says, shows to what degree the Teutonic peoples had been successfully alienated from their original character. So it's not even in the character of the Nordic Aryan type or the European man to fight over religion, because religion's not actually important. People are important. Ideas are not important. Human communities, the folk, are important. So the blood is what matters, not what people believe. And we're going to hear that direct inversion where people's values are irrelevant and their inborn status becomes primary. And again, I direct you to think about this. What is an American debate that we're hearing from the radical right now, because they are reinvigorating parts of this exact same logic in order to insist that there's something essentially people-oriented and ethnic about what it means to be an American. It is not just that America is not just a propositional nation or a commitment to an idea or something of this kind, but rather that it's a particular people in a particular place as a historical contingency. Very important to realize that in this feeling of alienation that's at the heart of this. Heritage Americans have been alienated from their original character by all these interlopers that have been being brought in. This is very important. History is rhyming. So he says, respect for religious belief was just as natural to the pagan Teutons as to the later Aryans. Only the claim by the Roman Church that it alone offered salvation hardened the European heart and necessarily called forth defensive struggles in the opposing camp, since likewise conducted for a alien-natured form resulted in spiritual narrow-mindedness named Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Puritanism. Okay, so what does he mean by all that? Okay, so first of all, it is the Roman Catholic Church claiming it's the only path to salvation, the only righteous road, and forcing that upon Europe that has caused the problem. It hardened the European heart, that this set off the struggles that became religious struggles, especially after Protestantism in all of its forms arises. So thus things like the 30 Years' War and all these bloody religious conflicts are actually down to this. It's people who are wrong and other people who are wrong, who have all denied their fundamental European, Teutonic, or Aryan character, who are fighting. So immediately in the first paragraph, what you see is we were a great people, and then the Roman Catholics and later the Protestants screwed it all up. And now for 1900 years, we've had war after war after war bearing the stamp of religious belief. And that's because the people of Europe have been alienated from who they are by these alien belief systems, these religions, which are Roman Catholicism and the forms of Protestantism. He goes on and says, but despite everything, most of the struggles by our leading historical heroes were conducted less for theological principles of belief about Jesus, Mary, the Holy Ghost, purgatory, and so on, than for character values. So it wasn't the beliefs themselves that people were fighting over, it was the fundamental values of character, which is not actually true, but that's how he characterizes it. It was actually these fights, these wars were fundamentally theological, whether there would be the Protestant focus on sola scriptura, salvation by faith alone, or whether there would be the Catholic structure that is not necessarily faith plus works, but it's faith plus tradition in the church. And this fight was hot, wild, dangerous, and bloody. Very, very important fights. But it was not actually about character values, except in this telling where character values are an extension of racial quality. And to have adopted the wrong character means that your racial quality has already been degraded. He said that explicitly in the previous chapter. The churches, he tells us, of all denominations declared, as the faith, so the man. Okay, so this is going to be the fundamental distinction he's going to set up. Christians, churches of all denominations, Catholic, and the Protestant denominations all declared the same thing. So this is why he's saying there's no theological difference. As the faith, so the man. That is, people are the values that they hold in faith. If you are convicted to a set of values, that's who you will be. The Nazis reject that utterly. Their belief is that there is a racial strain that is ultra predominant in Europe and nowhere else any longer in the world, and that those people are fundamentally better and their character shows through as a result of being racially better. And so they're going to reverse it. It is not that there is a universal quality of man, everybody made in Imago Dei, and they believe according to the right or wrong beliefs and choose or fail to choose righteousness. That idea is the problem to the Nazis. And the churches, he says, of all denominations declared, as the faith, so the man. This, he tells us, was necessary for every church and promised success, since in this way a man's value was made dependent on its coercive principles, and men were thus spiritually enchained to the chosen church organization. Now here we have this Gnostic impulse appearing. People are chained and imprisoned by a church that is seizing the means of production by telling of who they are, by telling them the lie that is their faith that will determine their character. The Nazi belief is no, your character is free of that. It is not a matter of faith. It is a matter of who you are in the blood. They don't just say it's not that. They have a different answer. It's in the blood. And so the whole point, this was necessary for every church and promised success, since in this way a man's value was made dependent on its coercive principles. So the church is like a demiurge. The church is like a structure that is trapping people into a coercive structure to make them believe and behave as the church wants them to. It is putting them into a false consciousness of faith and telling them that the faith determines the man, and so that this is centrally important. It will determine success or failure in life, and then they erect a corrupt system in order to enforce that so that it becomes true. This is the same idea, the same Gnostic imprisonment idea we find at the heart of Marxism. And his claim is that the result of that structure is that men are thus spiritually enchained to the chosen church organization. So you have the church with its wrong values that came from the wrong places as demiurge that's now controlling the free European man who has different values and different character because of who he is as a result of his blood having come from Atlantis, as we heard in the first episode regarding this book. He says, on the other hand, so in comparison, the Nordic European creed, whether consciously or unconsciously, so you don't even have to devote, if you're a Nordic European, you don't even have to devote yourself to a particular set of values or a particular set of ideas. You have character by virtue of being Nordic European. So you hold this Nordic European creed, whether consciously or unconsciously, has always been as the man, so his belief. Do you see that? It's a complete reversal. The churches hold as the faith, so the man, and the Nordic European is as the man, so his belief. This is how they set it up, that the race is determinative of character. And so how does this work in practice? That if you have the right race, they let you into the order. If you act wrong, they try to figure out how you have mixed blood and get rid of you. But the man, as the man, so his belief. So the man is not a universal. He is a particular. He is an object that is of a particular racial stock, and that gives rise to his character and his beliefs. That is a fundamental opposition and reversal of this structure that he's now pinning on the church. More exactly put, Rosenberg tells us, so the nature or content of his belief. If the belief protected the highest values of character, then it was real and good, irrespective of what expressions of human longing might otherwise have surrounded it. If it did not do so, if it represented proud personal values, then it must have been felt in the deepest innermost heart of every Teuton as bringing destruction. So the Teutons, or the Aryans as they become later, etc., the Nordic German or Nordic European, has values that erupt out of his race, and it doesn't matter how they actually appear in the world. It doesn't matter. The content of his belief comes from his character, and if that, it says, if the belief protected the highest values of character, then it was real and good, no matter what form it took. But if it didn't, if it represented personal values instead, something that the individual, not the collective, the folk cared about outside of the blood, then it must have been felt at the deepest innermost heart as bringing destruction. So there, he says, there are two values above all others in which for nearly 2,000 years the whole opposition between church and race, Why? Because the image bearer of God is raceless. Every human being is the image bearer of God. So the church holds this, that we're all image bearers of God. Notice that Jews also believe this, and they're not Christian, and they believe this too. And race is a separate thing. So there's an opposition, the whole opposition between church and race, he says, theology and belief, coercive doctrine and pride of character are revealed. So notice again, coercive doctrine is the church model as he said it, and the thing opposing it is pride of character upon which honor is built. And these are revealed. Two values, or two highest values for the last 2,000 years, he says, two values rooted in will, for which in Europe there has always been a struggle for predominance, love and honor. So the fundamental conflict in Europe and the European mind, society, and psyche is the conflict between valuing love and valuing honor. And as I said, love is weak, and love is Syrian and African and Etruscan and with the church, and or Jewish or Freemasonic or Russian, and honor, which is the Aryan spirit embodied inexorably. No matter what form it takes outwardly, it is inexorably what flows from the true Aryan. Both accordingly strove for recognition as highest values, Rosenberg says. The churches wished, however strange this may sound, to rule through love, whereas the Nordic Europeans wished to live free through honor or to die free in honor. Both ideas found martyrs ready for sacrifice, but this conflict did not always attain the clearest consciousness, however often it revealed itself. This recognition, he tells us, has persisted into our own day. It is a mythic experience, but nevertheless as clear as daylight. Love and sympathy, honor and duty are spiritual essences that, enveloped by different outward forms, represent driving life forces for almost all races and nations capable of culture. So we have two different ways that civilized people can go. They can base their lives on love and sympathy, which he's going to argue is a disaster, or on honor and duty, which is rooted in pride of accomplishment and very successful. Duty, remember, here is defined in a collective sense. Depending, he says, upon what room was made for love in its most general version, or the concept of honor as such, The world outlook and form of the people in question developed in a manner corresponding to this desired goal. One or the other idea formed the yardstick by which the whole of thought and action were measured. But in order to create a determinative characteristic for an epoch, one or the other ideal must predominate. So you can't have a society actually based on love and honor. It has to pick one or the other if we're going to have a determinative characteristic for an epoch, at least. The conflict between the two ideas, he says, can nowhere be followed more tragically than in the disputes between the Nordic race and its allies with the particular racial and ideological environment. With regard to what motive has above all proven itself as formative for the Nordic race in affairs of soul, state, and culture, it's evident that almost everything that has preserved the character of our race, our peoples and nations, has been in the first place the concept of honor, along with the idea of duty inseparably connected with it, originating from the consciousness of inward freedom. But from the moment at which love and sympathy, or if one wishes, quote, fellow feeling, became predominant, there also began the epochs of racial, national, and cultural dissolution in the history of all formerly Nordic determined states. So there you have it. Hey guys, let me interrupt the content here real quick to tell you about a cruise, a learning cruise that New Discourses is hosting this November 15th through 22nd, 2026. We're going round trip out of Tampa, Florida to all kinds of cool Caribbean locations, and we're going to have on-board lectures every day. This is the New Discourses Preserving Liberty Conference at Sea. I hope that you will join me and Michael O'Fallon and the whole team and everybody that loves New Discourses to have great conversations, to get to know each other, to have a little bit of a vacation, to learn a little bit about the things that we talk about here at New Discourses, you know, the whole 9 yards. So to get set up, to get all the information that you need to sign up, you need to go to ndcruise.com. That is ND for New Discourses, ndcruise.com. Everything's there. We'll see you on board. It's as cut and dry as it could be. You have two choices in your society. These values come from the deepest sources of our racial makeup, our character, and the choices are love or honor. Love is this crazy idea that there is a universal man, so as a man believes, so he is, as the faith, so the man. And in comparison, the Nordic rejects that, embraces an idea of duty to a collective folk rooted in, defined in terms of its blood. That's the myth of the blood part. And honor is predicated upon upholding one's duty in that system. And the idea is as the man, so his beliefs. The beliefs will come out of the man whose character is determined by his blood, such that in his pursuit for honor and to maintain his internal freedom and so on, he will have all the right values expressed no matter what way they express themselves. And this fundamental conflict is the maker or breaker of civilizations. If you get it wrong, if you believe in love and sympathy, there begin the epochs of racial, national, and cultural dissolution in the history of all formerly Nordically determined states, he says. And I'll just point out that this is the weird tension we find ourselves in dealing with woke. Woke is begging us for what, Gad Saad calls suicidal empathy. It's asking us to care about things not only that are so distant from us that it's not realistic, but also that are directly toxic, caring about criminals to the lunatic point where you don't want to put them into any kind of punishment or jail or deal with them at all. Homeless, the same thing. Other societal deviants, caring so much about the plight of minority populations who are claimed to be oppressed that we upend our society and basically turn it into a grifter's paradise. This is also the idea at the heart of socialism, the real reason socialism fails, going way beyond Hayek's correct material analysis that we can't answer the question of how to distribute goods and services without the market, which is an information sharing mechanism as well as a goods and services sharing mechanism, because it gives you literally real-time information about supply and demand, even if we only understand it tacitly. The real reason is that what we're trying to solve is how do you get people to be willing to solve the problems of strangers? In other words, put it in a more blunt way, how do you get people to care about people they don't care about? And the socialist answer is you beat them over the head with a government stick until they care about the things the state tells them to care about. Otherwise, they're terrible people. They're making the whole system collapse and they have to be killed or sent off to a work camp. While the capitalist answer is you don't make people care about people they don't care about. You give them an incentive structure called profit to be able to make self-interested money or gain off of finding ways that other people can come to them, buy the thing that they made to solve their own problems that they themselves actually care about. This is the difference between capitalism and socialism that's at the very core of everything. Socialism insists that people are supposed to care about things that they don't care about, and that the state should be empowered to beat the living shit out of them and kill them until they care correctly, while capitalism says that's frickin' impossible. That's not ever going to happen. It will never work. So what we're going to do is erect a system where people's private property is protected. Their right to private property into exchange of their private property are protected such that they can set the terms of exchange, and thus they can have an incentive, a profit motive, to create solutions to problems that other people that actually have those problems can come find and buy. That's the real story between socialism, which does not work, and capitalism, which does. Now, when we're looking at fascism or National Socialism, since we're talking about Nazis, the idea is that you're supposed to care about your folk, your race, your state, your people. And if you don't, the state is going to beat you over the head or call you a subversive and kill you. And they're going to make it a matter of duty and honor to do it. But it suffers the same problem. It does not actually solve the question or answer the question of how do you make people care about people they don't care about? You don't. That's why capitalism works, and all of these socialist models don't. That's the deepest and clearest thing I have ever said in the New Discourses podcast series. Go write it down. Okay, so now what he's going to do is give several examples. This is a tricky affair for doing this podcast, because I don't want to get caught up in his bashing of the Catholics. But first he's going to talk about the Indians, then he's going to talk about the Greek, and then he's going to go for pages and pages and pages and pages about the Catholics. Most of the chapter is about that. Then he dips into the Freemasons and Jews. Then he dips into the Russians. And that's it. That's the end of the chapter. So what we're going to do is summarize, kind of touch on each of these parts and save most of the Catholic stuff for later. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of this. I'm going to read another kind of big section that sets the conflict up. And we're going to touch on a little bit more, and we'll wrap this thing up. So the mythology of ancient India is the first place where he decides to show what he's talking about here. And I'll read just a little. I think a lot of my longtime listeners will find what he says interesting. But I'm not going to read a whole lot of this. In fact, I have a note that tells me exactly how far to read. So let me double check my note. The summary is that I've made notes about this, by the way. We get our information about India largely from theosophists and anthroposophists who emphasize a kind of peace and harmony view and ignore that India had an older value system that used to actually work, which was honor and duty, and the transition made them weak. It says read first paragraph. I think I might, yeah, that's right. It's just the first paragraph. Okay, so today he tells us about India. Hinduism and Buddhism are preached to the point of superfluity. The majority of us possess no other idea of India than as it is presented to us by the theosophists and anthroposophists. So notice that he's aware of theosophy and anthroposophy. He knows that these ideas, these mystical charlatan ideas are out there. Of course he does, because this book is largely based on Houston Stewart Chamberlain's book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, which has incorporated a ton of it. The Nazi ideology, by the time he's writing this, has incorporated a ton of something called Ariosophy that he doesn't mention, which is an Aryan-centered spin-off belief of the Theosophists. And the Theosophists, founded by Helena Blavatsky, Blavatsky are the people who first started talking about the relevance of the swastika, the Aryan race, the root race concept, the spiritual race or racial soul concept of human beings that they actually incorporated into this myth of the blood in a completely unique way that does not actually mirror what Helena Blavatsky had written. As much as I love to bash Helena Blavatsky, these people made some stuff up based on it, but it's clear here. Theosophist is a very specific word. It is clear by his use of it that he knows who these people are. And it's a giveaway. That's part of why I wanted to bring that up. But what he's saying is all we know about India is what people like Blavatsky have told us. He says, we speak of India as having a soft-hearted philosophy of life, merging with the universe, with human love as its highest teaching. Undoubtedly, the late philosophy flowing into infinity, the Vedanta Atma Brahman doctrine, Buddhism striving for redemption from the sufferings of this world, along with thousands of proverbs scattered throughout the whole of Indian literature, justify this interpretation. Nothing exists, he says, which cannot be accomplished by gentleness. So notice how much the Nazis are going to hate that idea, which is based literally on the idea that society should be regimented as an army and that war is the criterion of how nature, thus man, thus society has to work. Happy are those, he tells us, who withdraw into the forest after they have fulfilled the hope of the needy, have shown love for their enemies, and so on. That's what he's saying is the philosophy we understand of India. And yet, into those love and sympathy-filled products of the late Indian period, quite different older views intrude, which do not recognize personal feelings of happiness and absence of sorrow as the only goals worth striving for, but see the latter in the fulfillment of duty and the assertion of honor. In one of the oldest Indian poems, duty is even praised as a sixth inner sense. In the Mahabharata, the entire struggle revolves in its original form around this idea. And he goes on to talk about that in much detail. But what you ultimately have to take away, skipping down to the very last paragraph of this section, the ancient Indian kingdom kept to this manly concept of honor and made it the prerequisite of its social structure. But when this concept was replaced by ritual, religious, philosophical systems, denying all earthly limitations, coupled with racial decomposition, then religious, dogmatic, and economic viewpoints appeared authoritative. With the philosophy of Atman Brahman transposed to earthly life as elaborated earlier, the Aryan denied his own race, hence his own personality, and as a result also the idea of honor as forming the spiritual backbone of his life. So this is really kind of the punchline of why we're talking about this India section at all. This last sentence, we already talked about this idea of the Atman Brahman, the universalist impulse, right? And this universal love impulse. By doing this, he said, basically his argument previously was that the Aryans had set up the caste system. Then they started to believe that everybody has an image of the Brahman in their individual soul, the Atman, and therefore everybody has unique individual human dignity that has to be honored no matter what caste you're in. This led to miscegenation across the caste. This led to the dissolution of the Aryan race, the mixing of the Aryan race, and this led to a crappy India. But here he says it very clearly. By doing this, the Aryan denied his own race. That was the problem. He denied his own race. He's no longer got duty tied to his race and honor bound in supporting his race and acting in endogamy, only breeding or mating within his race. And what he lost, he says, by denying your own race, you lose your personality. The Aryan is no longer the Aryan after he starts to mix his blood. And then as a result, he lost his attachment to honor. Thus, this wishy-washy love feeling and universalism replace the ideas of duty and honor, and their society more or less collapsed. He then turns to talk about this same issue with the Greeks. Let me check my notes to find out how much of it I'm supposed to read. It's not much. First paragraph. Literally, my notes say these details are unimportant to our purposes. So Greek heroism is the name of this section. Love and sympathy, he says, even when they claim to comprise the entire world, nevertheless always direct themselves at the individual loving or suffering creature. So remember earlier when I said freedom has nothing to do with individual freedom? It's your freedom within the collective of the folk or the race. So the problem with love is that it directs itself at individuals, and it makes you soft because you care about a particular individual and the particular individual's condition, when what you should be thinking of is higher collectivist programs. You should not be thinking of that poor untouchable girl who's having a bad situation and getting beaten in the street and protect her. You should be thinking of the importance of maintaining the caste system that's leading to her being beaten because it protects your race. Your duty and honor are to a higher ideal, a collectivist ideal located in the person or in the collective of blood-given nation of folk, not in the individual situation. So that's where love and sympathy take people the wrong way. Now he's going to say that the Greeks were full of very aesthetically minded heroes, and that the heroism of Greeks collapsed under this idea of sympathy and empathy and pity. Always move in eros and agape in particular, the Greek love of brotherly love of agape, that we're going to love everybody as our brothers, that this is crap, and that's what destroyed the Greeks. The Hellenes had it right, and then the Greeks got poisoned by their lower racial components and led to this universalism. And where it weakens you is that love directs itself at individual loving or suffering creatures, thus denying the collective nature. Again, these people are woke fundamentally differently than the left in a lot of ways, but they are woke in the same sense. They are collectivist. Their collection is based on a sense of alienation that they're going to overcome. The solution to their problem is to assert power, claim power, seize the means of production of mankind through an identity-driven political movement, etc., etc. The means will justify the ends. The Machiavellian techniques are all on the table because they serve something higher than this lower stuff, like caring about an individual suffering or loved creature. He says, but the wish to liberate others or oneself from suffering is purely a personal feeling that lacks anything strongly formative of race or state. So in other words, so you want to liberate yourself or others from suffering, right? That's just emotions, he's saying. That's just emotions. And you can't build with that. It's not strongly formative of two particular things, race and state. So you're not purifying and strengthening your people and its racial characteristic, nor are you building a powerful state apparatus as an extension of that. By caring about people you're not supposed to care about, by wanting to take people out of suffering. Suffering is an inevitable part of a hard-ass life, and the race has to take care of itself, and the state has to protect the race. That's the mentality in the heart of this Nazi ideology. He goes on, he says, the love of what is nearest or what is farthest. So let's talk about our heat map thing of the moment, right? Obviously, we've got that very popular meme out there, the heat map thing that came from that paper that showed that the left cares about causes far away from themselves, while the right tends to care about causes that are closer to themselves. The love of what is nearest or what is farthest can produce deeds of supreme self-sacrifice, but, he says, this is nevertheless a spiritual power related to the individual, and no man has ever in seriousness demanded the sacrifice of an entire state or of an entire people for the sake of a love unrelated to the latter. So you have to be connected to the idea of the collective, of the people or of the state that incorporates it. This is where we have fascism operating as idolatry of the state, creeping into the discussion without being too explicit. He says, and nowhere has an army yet sacrificed itself for this, meaning for love. And he goes on to talk about Athenian life appears to us as fundamentally milder than the ancient Indian. Admittedly, in Greece, a heroic epic also speaks of heroic deeds, but these have more of an aesthetic foundation. So they were artsy-fartsy, and they didn't get into it in a hard way. And we go on and on. I'm not going to read many pages about the Greeks. But he does talk at the end about Alexander. Through Alexander, a more disciplined idea of late Greek life, primarily aesthetic, once again predominated, and which was also conscious of racial differences. Alexander did not unconditionally pursue the aim of a world monarchy and the mixing of peoples, but wished only to unite the Persians and Greeks, who were recognized as racial kindred. So Alexander Good, by the way, and to bring them under one rule so as to avoid further wars. He recognized the driving ideas and character values of the Persian upper stratum, that's your Aryans, by the way, as being related to his own Macedonian idea of duty. For this reason, he therefore only placed Macedonians or Persians in leading posts, whereas Semites, Babylonians, and Syrians were deliberately excluded. After Alexander's death, his successors made efforts to emulate his type of state in their lands and provinces. Like a hero from primeval times stands out one-eyed Antigonus, who at the age of 80 and this is died 301 BC, who at the age of 80 falls in combat on the battlefield against the lawful heirs when he was unable to unite the kingdom. The Nordic Macedonian cultural offshoots, however, were not permanent enough. Admittedly, they nurtured Greek science, art, and philosophy, but they did not possess the power to act as a type forming, to set through their idea of honor. The subjugated alien blood triumphed, inaugurating an age of clever but characterless Hellenism. Now we turn to the main section that I'm going to read for the rest of the podcast, although I'm going to dip into the stuff below. Honor among Nordic Germans. This section is very long by comparison to the ones we've already talked about, and it actually goes off course. It doesn't just talk about Vikings primarily, but the honor of the Nordic Germans. It's going to go off course and start ranting about the Catholics. So after this, he has basically like a 50-page rant about the Catholics and how awful they are. Then he finally reels that in and starts talking about the Freemasons and the Jews and the Russians, and closes out the chapter with a call for a new Germanic Christianity, which I'm going to separate out from this episode. In the next episode, we're going to go into this Catholic hate and then talk about that new Christianity to close. But for now, let's talk about honor among Nordic Germans and his introduction to his rant against Catholics. He says, if the concept of honor has ever formed the center of all existence, then it's in the Nordic Germanic West. So he's now said, look, okay, here we have these dalliances with honor versus love in India and in Greece and like whatever, and we've already kind of set the stage. Well, where do you have this idea of honor and duty really, really importantly? In the Nordic Germanic West. That's our value. That's that's why they think they're better than everybody, okay? With a self-reliance unique in history, the Viking appears, he says. So the Viking is part of the Nordic Germanic West in his mind. The unbound feeling of freedom pushes one Nordic wave after the other out into the unknown as the population increases. With a squandering of blood and a heroic unconcern, the Viking sets up his states in Russia, Sicily, England, and France. Here, primal racial impulses dominated without restraint and discipline, unhampered by reflection of purpose or an exactly determined system of law. Freeze. Okay. You probably didn't expect Rousseau to enter the chat, but here what we have is this idea that if we go backwards far enough, we find the noble, not savage, but the noble Viking, the noble Aryan, the noble Nordic, the noble Atlantean. If we go back, we find the noble character, and that character is what? Racial impulses are his dominant strand. That's how they work. That's the state of nature for humans, is that they operate out of their racial impulses. They do so without restraint and discipline. But where does that restraint and discipline come from? Reflection of purpose and an exactly determined system of law. So just like where Rousseau in France in the mid-1700s was looking at the savages out in the colonial projects and thinking, wow, they live such free, unhampered lives without civilization holding them down. Here you have Rosenberg saying, wow, look at the Vikings, how badass they were. It's because they never had to reflect on their purpose, operate in a civilized society, or operate under an existing exactly determined system of law. It's ironic that he says that this is the ideal, because what he's going to impose is the Führer principle, which is a rigid hierarchical system of brutal law, but the goal is to use that to reinvigorate the race. It's the goal of this, to seize the means of racial production, to reinvigorate the race where you won't need it in the future. Just like with the communists, right? You're going to take people and you're going to force them into a communist situation so that they become socialists again, so they can be the savage made to live in cities that Rousseau talked about, and you don't have to have a state anymore, and you can have a stateless, classless society. Isn't that very interesting that this parallelism appears? He says the primary value that the Northman carried with him is the concept of personal honor. That's why you didn't need a system of law. He had honor. He wasn't going to do anything wrong because his honor depended on it. Honor and freedom, he says, drove individuals into the distance in search for independence, into lands where there was space for masters, and the same urges caused them to fight to the last man on their farms and castles. Now, no doubt the Vikings were brave and tough and all this stuff, but that is not actually what drove their spread. It was not, in fact, honor and freedom driving individuals into the distance, looking for independence and places where they could be masters. It was the fact that they had a polygamous society, and the strong men took all the women, and the other men had to go try to find places where they could be in control so they could steal all the women. That was the real reason that the Vikings were doing what they were doing, is that the strong guys took all the girls, and the weaker guys were possessed by a desire to have girls, and the only way you could get them was to go conquer stuff and steal girls. There you go. This is historically not quite the story, but this is typical of Rosenberg. But let's go back to how he describes them. A happy contentedness, he says, with earthly existence, remote from all trading interest. No, it's like that meme, right? It's like, what a weird thing, or what an odd thing to say, right? Was it Bart Simpson? What an odd thing to say here. A happy contentedness with earthly existence, remote from all trading interests. So these guys are not fans of trading, aka capitalism, was the basic feature of Nordic man when he appeared in the West as a force, forming history despite all youthful impetuosity. So remember earlier when he said that that the man makes the beliefs and it doesn't matter what form they take. That's what he was covering for right here. Now he's like, oh, they had youthful impetuosity. They were impetuous. They were young. They didn't know better. But in fact, what they were brutal conquerors and thieves of women. Close followers grouped around individual personalities, he says, that then gradually led by necessity to the establishment of social laws, and finally, after migration, a sedentary kind of rural life ensued, one which in the South naturally disintegrated and perished in a late Oriental glittering decay. How? By hooking up with them Italian women and watering down their genes. Seldom, he says, is a second example offered to the observer of history, during which the conduct of a people could be determined so purely and completely by a single highest value. All power, all property, every bond, every action is directed to the service of honor, for which life is even offered as a sacrifice if necessary. So here you have this kind of like glittering generality. Again, it's kind of funny because like his whole thing is preservation of the race is what you have to do. But the real reason that they went and conquered all the parts of Europe was so that they could steal women from the other parts of Europe where they conquered and mate with them because they weren't able to in their Viking society. So the mixing of races was literally the freaking point. And then he's like, well, that's how it all kind of fell apart, right? But then we get this glittering generality. Seldom is a second example offered to the observer of history during which the conduct of a people could be determined so purely and completely by the single highest value, which is honor. And he says that that's the source of all of their power, all of their property, every bond, every action is in line with honor. And he characterizes it as the willingness to sacrifice everything, including your life. And he goes on and says, without reflection and without a flicker of the eyelashes, no emotion, no pity, pure stoicism. As the law of honor rules life, he says, so it is reflected in poetry and passes as a fundamental principle through the world of sagas. One encounters, There no other word so frequently as that of honor. Quote, therefore, the Nordic world of heroes, with its wild discord, its bubbling over subjectivism, is nevertheless so uniform in its nature and direction of destiny. Quoting Krieg. I don't know what from Krieg. It is, well, I do. It's in German and I can't say it. Menschenformung or something like that. Page 154. It is pleasing in advance. I messed that up. He goes on. It is pleasing to find in advance these recognitions among circles of German scholars who hitherto had been caught up in graceful aestheticism. So they cared, like the Greeks, about things looking good and being, oh, look at the beautiful music, look at the beautiful art. They're caught up in aestheticism. And now you have these new scholars that are rewriting history. And he says, pleasing to find these people who had been caught up in that, who are now being cool hard asses. Here, he says, the nerve of destiny in our entire history is touched. Our European and German future is decided from the nature of the valuation of the idea of honor. Even if ancient Nordic man acted violently, so he's got to kind of mention it a little bit, a little limited hangout on that one. Even if he was a little bit violent, then the center of his being, conscious of honor, created a pure atmosphere, even in battle and death. Quote, war could be conducted brutally, but to admit to his deed was regarded as the first requirement of the Nordic man. End quote. Again, quoting from Krieg. So this is okay. So what he's just said is, look, now we have historians that are glossing these guys, and yeah, they were violent and stuff. But no, it was pure. It was good. It was pure. So they're glossing this idea of a very brutal, violent character in the past by saying that the reason it was okay that they acted that way, that it shocks our conscience now, but that's because we have the wrong values, and they were expressing the right values just in their own way. That's why he had to make that disclaimer earlier when he said the man makes the values, or man makes the belief. As the man, so his belief, is what he said is their fundamental Nordic belief structure or attitude. And then he's like, and sometimes like it doesn't express itself the best way, but they had the right intentions. So again, does that sound like communism to you? Maybe Antifa got a little out of control, but they were trying to liberate black people from white supremacy, so it's okay. Doesn't that sound a little, revolutionary terrorism and violence in the name of the Paris Commune or the Bolsheviks taking over? But sometimes, as Walter Duranty said in the New York Times, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Doesn't that sound familiar? It's the same ideology. It's the same means justify the ends. Sorry, I do it backwards like 80% of the time. It's the same ends justify the means logic. The ends is that you're going to have this perfect society where the means of human production are seized, controlled, and thus taking humans to a better, more appropriate, more in line with their fundamental nature end. And in the name of doing that, you can hurt or destroy anything, and it's still considered pure. This is that same wokeness that we keep talking about. He says this feeling of responsibility demanded of each individual personality was the most effective defense against the moral swamp, against that hypocritical decomposition of values that in the course of European history has come over us as an alien temptation in the different forms of humanity. That's an interesting sentence, right? So he's claiming that this honor gives a sense of responsibility. The responsibility is to the race, remember? And it demands of each individual personality. Why does he say it? Not demands of each individual, but of each individual personality, because the personality is like the fungible part within the individual who is a member of his race. It's the same mentality as that, like all racial minorities have to have a critical theory disposition, right? So they're individual personalities within a determined collective. That woke collectivist mentality is being expressed there with that little bit of linguistic judo. And it says that is the most effective defense against the moral swamp. So what's really funny is this is probably part of why they hate the Jews so much, is what they're expressing is fundamentally this idea that the Jews basically perfected, which is you have a responsibility to keep these commandments, the mitzvot, the 613 commandments as it's usually given. You have this responsibility to do that, and God will bless you. That's the covenant if you do that, right? So Jewishness is the belief that they believe they're taking on a responsibility to keep commandments, and the commandments are the commandments allegedly given by God. But these people don't believe that God is the source of blessings. It is the race, it is the folk, it is the people themselves, just like how the communists are going to be the people who regenerate Eden. Here we have these people are going to regenerate Eden, or they're going to generate the perfect human society, and the way that they're going to do it is by being loyal or honorable to the human group, not to the commandments, but to the race, not to something transcendent to human, but to something that is fundamentally what they believe is the best part of what it means to be human. So you can see that the Jewish idea that would say that's a human thing, that is an idolatry, you can't do that, while saying this is the right way to do it, is going to be fundamentally horrifying and offensive to their project. He says sometimes, so this has come over, what happened was, is that honor to the collective, that duty to the collective, he says, is the most effective defense against the moral swamp, against that hypocritical decomposition of values that in the course of European history has come over us as an alien temptation of the different forms of humanity. Sometimes it has called itself democracy, sometimes social sympathy, sometimes humility and love. Those are the things that he's standing against. Those are the temptations into destruction in his mind. Literally alien temptations that take you into the moral swamp: democracy, social sympathy, humility, and love. The personal honor, he says, of the Northlander demanded courage and self-control. He did not gossip for hours like the Greek heroes before every battle. He did not cry out like the latter when wounded, but his consciousness of honor demanded tranquility in the conservation of strength. Seen from this aspect, the Viking is in fact the man of culture, while the aesthetically perfected late Greek is the barbarian, left behind devoid of a center. So here we have another inversion. Rather than seeing the late Greek period as the kind of this height of ancient civilization, literally the word barbarian refers to the bar noises that were of the Northmen that they were criticizing as uncouth. He's now inverting that and saying, no, the Greeks were the barbarians because they didn't have this, because they gossiped before their battles, they cried out in pain, they weren't stoic enough, etc. So the inversion occurs again in his rewrite of history, and he says the words of Fichte, quote, "True culture rests upon disposition, reveals our true Nordic nature when facing other cultures whose highest value is not character, which for us is synonymous with honor and duty, but another sense of value, another idea around which its life revolves," end quote. So he's attributing this view actually to Fichte, earlier German philosopher. I'm not going to get into. The destinies, he says, of the Western peoples have taken on diverse forms in the course of time, conditioned by different circumstances. Everywhere that Nordic blood predominates, the concept of honor is present. However, it is also mixed with other ideals, because nowhere has the race been kept pure. This is revealed by vernacular sayings, he says. So he's doing a little deep reading on how people talk about themselves to show that they don't have the right values. In Russia, the idea of a church of religious feeling has become dominant. So that's good, right, guys? No, not to the Nazis, which cloaks even the wildest outbreak with religious fervor. Consider, for example, the man in Dostoevsky's Idiot who commits a murder for the sake of a silver watch, but says a prayer beforehand. The Russian, therefore, speaks of his motherland as Swataya. I don't know how to say that in Russian. It's not even spelled right. Swataya Rossiya. That is, I'm sorry, Russians. I have no freaking idea. It's spelled with J's after W's and Swataya Rossiya. I don't know. Holy Russia. So the Russian therefore speaks of his motherland as Holy Russia. The Frenchman approaches life from the formally aesthetic aspect. France is therefore for him La Belle France, the beautiful France. Similarly, the Italian, who would also use the aesthetic approach. The Englishman is proud of his logical historical development of traditional forms of life. He therefore admires his old England. But with us, despite many displeasing attributes, reference is still always made with identical fervor to German loyalty, which proves that our metaphysical nature still feels the mark of honor as its permanent base. So here he's saying the Russians have become religious, and so they see themselves as, belonging to Holy Russia. The French and the Italians see their nations as beautiful. And the English, this is very interesting, the English are Old England, the traditionalists. So if you're an American who believes we've inherited from the English tradition and that we are in some sense a offshoot from the English tradition that in many ways carries its continuity, as did, say, John Jay in Federalist Number 2, which is a very important piece that's often used to bolster this idea that we are a particular people. If you believe that we are English, what characterizes our culture is being traditional, conservative, actually, not loyal to a friend-enemy distinction conception of politics. So when conservatives reject the woke right and say we don't need this European trash concept, this is part of what they're talking about. We don't need a European French liberalism, and we don't need a European German loyalty honor culture, and both the woke left and woke right are un-American. He says around this concept of honor then ultimately revolved the lasting struggle over millennia, when Nordic Europe saw itself facing the armed Roman South and was finally subjugated in the name of religion and Christian love. Now here he goes. This is where he's going to start. He's supposed to be talking about about German honor, and he's just going to go rip the Catholics now like for 50 pages. Okay, we're not going to go through all 50 pages. We're going to read the rest of this section and some of it. He says it is certainly beyond question that even without the intrusion of armed Roman Syrian Christianity, an epoch of German history, the mythological era, had ended. Nature symbolism gave way to a new morally metaphysical system, a new form of belief, but this form would undoubtedly have been invested by the same spiritual content, with the idea of honor as its leitmotif and yardstick. However, with Christianity, a different spiritual value penetrated through and laid claim to first place: love in the sense of humility, mercy, subjection, and asceticism. Okay, so those are the things that he hates about Christianity. Love in the sense of humility, mercy, subjection, and asceticism. And the problem he's saying is, look, it doesn't matter that the Roman Church conquered us. It really doesn't matter. We are who we are. As the man, so is belief. Honor would have protruded through, except that a new value system became the social yardstick. And it laid claim to first place. It displaced honor and replaced it with love in the sense of humility, mercy, subjection, and asceticism. Today, he says it's clear to every honest German that with this doctrine of love, which included all creatures in equal degree, a sorry blow was struck against the soul of Nordic Europe. So the curse that destroyed Europe, in his opinion, is Catholicism, or Christianity, actually, and Catholicism being its primary vehicle. Christianity, he says, in the way it took shape as a system, did not recognize the ideas of race and nation because it represented a violent merging of diverse elements. It also did not recognize the idea of honor because in pursuing Rome's latter aims of power, it proceeded with subjection not only of bodies but also of souls. All right, it'd be pretty hard for him to damn Christianity more than this. I just want all of my so-called Christian Nazi enjoyers out there who think you're edgy, cool, or like tapping into something. These guys hated you. They hated you on a profound fundamental level. They blamed the failure of Germany in World Wars I and II. They blamed the failure of Europe itself, the conflicts, the religious conflicts, the entire nature of everything going wrong in Europe on Christians, on Christianity. It's very explicit. It was Christianity, in the way it took shape as a system, did not recognize the ideas of race and nation. So, no, your Christian nationalism thing that you're being pushed into doesn't make sense. It represents a violent merging of diverse elements. That's going to be Syrianism, Africanism, Levant or Jewish thinking, and Etruscan horror shows, as he put it in the previous chapter. It also did not recognize the idea of honor because in pursuing Rome's latter aims of power, so Rome is corrupt, it wants power. He's got 40 pages of how corrupt Rome is coming up, guys. He does not like the Catholics. This really could be called Alfred Rosenberg Hates Catholics, or Nazis Hate Catholics, or something like that. Rome was just pursuing power, therefore it subjected not only bodies, but it also subjected souls. It forced people into the Catholic mold and subjected their souls. It is, again, this is a Gnostic liberation myth that he's actually telling. The German spirit is now imprisoned in a Catholic Christian doctrine that it has to break free from. That's the story here of Love and Honor. That is the core story. Very important to understand that this is the way the Nazis viewed this. We start talking about positive Christianity or any of this stuff. You start looking at these so-called pastors out here saying Hitler was right. For God's sake, man. Do you have any idea what heresies you're talking about? He says, but it's characteristic that the idea of love was in fact also unable to set itself through in the conduct of church institutions, both organizationally, so the churches are also hypocrites. They preach love, but they don't practice it. Both organizationally as well as dogmatically, the structure of the Roman system has been from the first day fundamentally and consciously intolerant, rejecting all other systems, if not to say hate-filled toward them. He here quotes or addresses Nietzsche. Nietzsche made a similar observation, quote, as is well known, priests are the most evil of enemies, but why? Because they are the most powerless. From their powerlessness, their hate grows among them into something huge and terrifying. To the most spiritual and most poisonous manifestations, the really great haters in world history and the most spiritual haters have always been priests, end quote, from On the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. So that's who he quotes to justify how intolerant the Roman Catholic Church is. This guy is no fan of Catholics. Priests are super evil, he's saying. Wherever it could, Rosenberg goes on, it proceeded to assert itself by excommunication, outlawry, fire, sword, and poison. So the Catholic Church didn't convert people by convincing them. It went through excommunication, outlawry. Becoming an outlaw means that the law no longer protects you. It's a very bad situation to be in. Fire, sword, and poison. Apart from moral evaluations, we can only confirm this fact, which indeed is not even denied by recent Roman Catholic writers. But this fact, proves more than all others that no type forming, that means race developing, by the way, type forming power is inherent in the idea of love, because even the organization of the religion of love has been built up without love. So here he's saying, look, the Catholic Church is supposedly, or Christianity is the religion of love, and it couldn't even build itself with love. There's no way to build something. There's no way to create an identity, to forge a collective based on love. And this occurred, he said, in fact, with much less love than other type-forming powers. The ancient Goths tolerated, as Ignaz von Dollinger proves, both the Catholic as well as other beliefs, and showed a faith felt to be spiritually necessary as such. This toleration vanished everywhere when the spirit of Bonifacius and the compulsory law of love triumphed. So we have literally idiots in the Christian nationalist movement talking about the Boniface option. Boniface came and chopped down the pagan idols and tree in Germany and forced Christianity, which was Catholic Christianity, onto the people. And they're like, this is great. This is what we want as Christians. And here we have our good Nazi saying that that's what actually destroyed Europe. In this connection, he says, one should compare the conduct of the heathen Frisian Duke Redbad, died 719 AD, in contrast to the Roman will to persecution. He remained true to the belief of his forefathers, but nevertheless did not persecute the Christian preachers. When several particularly zealous Christian missionaries were brought before him, and one of them, despite the Duke's resultant anger, still courageously represented the new faith, the heathen Duke said, quote, I see that you do not fear our threats and that your words are as your works, end quote. and sent the missionaries back with all honors to Pippin, the Duke of the Franks. So reports Alcuin. In nobility of soul, this pagan Frisian duke stands far above the representative of God in Rome, that's the Pope, guys, who made great efforts to banish this inner freedom and respect from the world. So here he tells the story that the missionaries came and they were going to get beaten by the pagans out of their faith, and they held to their faith, and that the pagans were so high-minded, and they recognized that that was so courageous that they sent them off to be somewhere else, but in honor, and that's nobility of the soul, and that the Pope can't even match this basic pagan nobility, is his argument. He says it isn't easy for any German to, by the way, I'm telling you, 50 pages of him just trashing Catholics like this, worse and worse and worse. It isn't easy for any German to, he only gives like 5 pages to Jews and Freemasons after that. It isn't easy for any German, he says, to express a negative evaluation in the face of the Etruscan Jewish Roman system, for despite the way the latter is constructed, that's the Roman Catholic Church, guys, it has nevertheless been ennobled by the sacrifice of millions of Germans. So they did a genocide to us. The Catholics genocided us. Sounds like Palestinians. They have taken over what is alien in this, together with what is strange but spiritually related. They respected the first less, shaped the second lovingly, and asserted many a Nordic value within the whole. Nonetheless, today, at a time of great spiritual change, the truth demands the examination of what emanates from Rome concerning whether it is furthering of life or harmful to the nature of the Germanic West. This must be undertaken not from the standpoint of personal ill will, but by surveying the great tensions and detensionings of history over more than 2,000 years, and in investigation of the racial soul values conditioning these upheavals. Then we will see that fundamentally the same struggle by the Greeks and Romans has fallen to the Germans. That's the repelling of Christian love, in case you lost the bead here. They can just as little escape this struggle as the other two great Nordic folkish waves, because the latter, in their ebbing backwards, carried within themselves the Asiatic spiritual values, that's Christianity, once overthrown by them, and the human material embodying these values. So the racial contamination, it's not just ideas and beliefs, it's racial contamination too, the human material embodying these values. Remember, the race produces the values, not the values adopted by a person. They carried these with them over Hellas, far over the Alps, beyond the frontiers of German living space, at times into the heart of the Nordic race itself. But if one traces back the causes why this was so successful, then we discover that one of the most important factors was the challenge of Germanic greatness of heart, alongside the earlier technical superiority of the older, more experienced South. This, he says, occurred at a time of religious crisis in Teutonic life that alone would not have explained such a long-lasting victory. This greatness of heart, which is shaped allegorically forever in Siegfried, and which presupposes an opponent with the same valuing of honor and open form of battle, indeed whose childlike honesty cannot believe the contrary, has contributed to many a hard defeat for the Germans in the course of their history. This happened once when it began to admire Rome, and in recent times when it carried out the emancipation of the Jews and thereby granted poison equal rights with healthy blood. So you got to have that jab there. So emancipating Jews in Germany, which was kind of not really that fully done, had led to he sees this literally as granting poison equal rights with healthy blood. And this is just a greater extension of this concept that caring about the downtrodden or the worse off, or having sympathy or operating in love or believing in a universal humanity will eventually poison your race. He says the first took a terrible revenge on the wars of the heretics in the 30 Years' War that brought Germany close to the abyss. The second, that's the Jews thing, has its revenge today when the poisoned German national body is seized by the gravest convulsions. So writing in 1930, again, we're talking about World War I, we're talking about the sanctions. Then the Americans have come in and offered huge loans. They've stabilized the German economy. Then the Great Depression starts in America in 1929, shatters the German economy even worse. These are gravest convulsions, and he's blaming the Jews for all these things that are being disrupted in the world. Again, this is one of those moments where like history's rhyming. Our young people are like, oh my God, what's going on? We're unsettled. We have a massively changing technological environment. Old stories are less and less believable in some cases. People are searching for a new path, a new foundation, new stories, new narratives, etc. And there's convulsions around the world, whether it's wars, whether it's disruptions to trade routes, whether it's the attempted establishment of BRICS, whether it's the attack to divide America from within, etc. And he says, in both of these powers hostile to us still call upon, that's Rome and Jews, both of these powers hostile to us still call upon the greatness of heart found within the gravely sick, upon the latter's justice, preach love of all humanity, and make efforts to finally gnaw away all remaining resistance of character. So even though they have already achieved, Jews and Catholics have already achieved so much victory over the Germans, they still want more. That's the mentality. A complete triumph of this humanity bad, by the way. Humanity is one of those values. It's the wrong value. Honor good, humanity bad. A complete triumph of this humanity would have had the same consequences as once the victory of Asia over Athens and Rome, so that the latter, once the deadly enemy of the Etruscan Pelasgian Syrian world, became virtually the chief representative of these same forces after the original values of ancient Rome had collapsed, a collapse that was due to physical decomposition, that's racial mixing, and the preaching of the aloneness of humanity and love. But the doctrine of love was not a type-forming power, even in its most beautiful form, but a power-melting resistance. Same theme, right? In order to preserve itself as a type-forming power and to assert itself further, so the church is supposed to be based on love, which doesn't do type-forming, but it's going to make itself one. In order to preserve itself as a type-forming power and to assert itself further, the type being Christians, the church could not and would not recognize any love, but it could certainly pursue power politics with the aid of love. If the consciousness of personality, of defending honor, and of manly duty are transformed into humility and love-filled dedication, then the impulse to resistance against the forces organizing and directing the belief in humility and love is broken. A herd and a shepherd. Taken literally as was demanded, this has been the clearest declaration of struggle against the German spirit. Not a big fan of the Catholics, guys. If this idea, or Christianity, if this idea had completely triumphed, then Europe today would consist only of a characterless human horde numbering many millions, ruled with the aid of a highly cultivated fear of purgatory and everlasting tortures of hell, paralyzed by love in the struggle for a feeling of honor, but its better parts in service of a humanitarian philanthropism represented by caritas, or charity. This is the condition for which the Roman system was forced to strive insofar as it wished to exist at all and as a spiritual and political power. So his claim is that that Europe would be a characterless human horde ruled by a highly cultivated fear of specters like purgatory and hell, paralyzed by its grip on Christian love and charity. So charity becomes a prime value, and what you end up with is a decrepit society that doesn't work. The next section is actually titled Christian Elimination of Personality, and it is every bit as vicious as you might imagine. I don't know if I should reserve this for the next podcast or do it now. It's not super long, but I'll give you a taste, I suppose. He starts this off, Christian Elimination of Personality, by saying, "It is not my intention here to write a history of dogmas. I wish only to describe a logical system with which an awakening Nordic man must of necessity come permanently into the gravest spiritual conflict. Either he subjects himself to it completely, as at times in the Middle Ages, or he rejects it according to feeling and consciously in principle. In the first event, an external authority is attained for a brief time, which, however, must collapse on account of its organic impossibility as the great struggles show up to Dollinger. In the second event, the way is free for real organic culture and a true form of belief according to blood and race. The last centuries have stood under the mark of a compromise that didn't touch upon any fundamental questions of world outlook, but only organizational and political relationships. And then he starts. It is the characteristic of Roman Christianity that wherever possible it eliminates the personality of its founder in order to put in its place the church structure of a rulership by priests. Jesus is admittedly set up as the highest and holiest, as the source of all faith and bliss, but only for the purpose of investing the church, representing him with the halo of an eternal and untouchable glory. Between Jesus and man, the church and its representatives intrude with the assertion that the only way to Jesus lies through the church. Since Jesus doesn't live on earth, humanity is in fact only concerned with that church which is fully authorized to bind or release forever the utilization of the belief in Jesus Christ, for the power politics of a self-deifying league of priests forms the essence of Rome, in the same way as under other names it formed that of priestly politicians in Egypt, Babylon, and Etruria. This goes on. I'll save this as the beginning. To strengthen the power of the doctrines and statutes protecting the priestly league of men, a great art of dialectics was used by pious individuals, one that traced back all church edicts over 1,500 years to the Gospels, with the emphasis, however, that the church alone possessed the right to dispense the faultless dogmas of universal validity. He goes on and on now for nearly 50 pages, trashing over 30 pages, sorry, we've already read some of it. It goes on and on for over 30 pages, trashing Christianity and the Catholic Church in these kinds of very, very, very strong new atheist sounding tones. Okay, the last paragraph of this section, I'm going to read this section in the next paragraph, next episode, so we'll get a repeat of it. The last elimination of human self-reliance in favor of an unreal office is perfected in the sacraments. The sacramental blessing is not produced by the personal moral and religious efforts of their receiver, but far more through the objective completion of the sacramental token itself. So it's just an act, it's performative. With this, the annihilation of the personality is demanded. So participating in the sacramental structure of Catholicism demands an annihilation of your personality. You don't become a person anymore, you subscribe to the church. And its valuelessness as religious doctrine is announced, he says, in the midst of a people who had placed honor, personal honor, family honor, race honor, national honor. What's wrong with nationalism, James? Above all else as the midpoint of life, the open broadcasting of such a demand would never have been able to be carried through. This has only been possible through the skilled replacing of the concept of honor by that of love, followed by humility and devotion. That this sacramental token is represented as having been established by Jesus himself should be noted only as a small proof of the lack of concern by which history is formed and religious structures are built. It does not get nicer. It gets much worse. Christian paganism. It is self-evident that these ideas of a doctrine aiming at magic could not be maintained in such a barren representation, even after the denial of honor as a guiding idea. The blood-related customs of Nordic man and his knightly way of thinking were unable to be completely driven out, even with fire and sword. So the church then proceeded to the incorporation of popular pre-Christian parables. So this whole section is how Christian paganism, this whole section is about how the church basically stole pagan ideas, wrapped them up in Christian language and saints and festivals and so on. It reads like something straight out of the New Atheists. The quest for power is the next section after that, which is about the church. High corruption in the church. This is mostly about indulgences and intercession in the church. Very long section, trashing it. Loyola, why can't I say that? Loyola, I know how to say Loyola. I can't say it. Laugh, guys, laugh. I can't say it. Loyola. Ignatius de Loyola. I can't say it at the moment. Jesuitism and blind obedience. So now he's going to trash the Jesuit order. Loyola, I can say it. Ignatius Loyola, I can't say it. What the heck? Anyway, I digress. We'll come back to that, and I'll practice saying it, apparently. Papal infallibility. Boy, does he spend a lot of pages going after that. That's a section. Tragedy averted temporarily is, I think, where I'm supposed to pick up. Let me check my notes. No, I'm not doing that. That is a part of the punchline of the next episode. Knightly honor. So I'm not going to read this, but this is what he's going to compare it to. He's going to talk about how the Germans and the Europeans had knightly honor, and that knightly honor is the exact opposite of basically what the church taught. And, it's going to be all power and strength and Beowulf. He talks about Beowulf a lot here and how strong that is, but how it got corrupted by, this namby-pamby stuff that's not so knightly. And then the Roman contempt of honor and culture. Roman does not mean Rome as in the Roman Empire. Roman means the Roman Catholic Church. Another apparently an ineradicable falsification of history dominates even today those circles that gave a clear account of Rome and its system, namely that all education and culture that gradually passed over the West was a consequence of church activity. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. So he's going to claim that the church has lied to say that it has been the carrier of culture in Europe, and in fact, it was the opposite. It was not. Timeless virtues of Frederick the Great. He gives us a counterpoint. So Frederick the Great is held up as a great example of German Nordic honor. And then he gets down to this section, Jews and Freemasons. And this is where I wanted to pick up because I want to talk, we've talked a lot about the honor. We talked a lot about this. Okay, so what we've talked about so far is love versus honor, and the German Nordic ideas: honor, duty, freedom, but the freedom to actually uphold your duty and your honor, which is to the collective called the folk or the race or the state. And everything should be based upon that. And he's contrasted that now for 30-something pages, 40 pages or whatever, against the Catholic idea of love, the Christian idea of love as well, more broadly than just Catholics, and how that brings up kind of a humanitarian view of life. It brings up this idea of charity, has this idea of brotherly love, agape, it has this idea of imago Dei, of equality of all men and their claim to dignity and justice, and that's all crap and has basically ruined Europe. But he's now going to shift and say there's another couple of ways that love gets expressed in other cultures that are also problems. So the next section, as I've read down or skipped down through, is called Jews and Freemasons. And as soon as you see the title of that, you're like, oh, I bet that one's juicy. Less than you think. But I'm going to read a little bit of it, not the whole thing. It says, let me check my notes real quick because I think I wrote how much of it I want to read. About 3 pages of it, down to the part where he talks about Frederick the Great again. So he says, Jews and Freemasons. This new doctrine of humanitarianism. So that's where he left off. We can go back a little bit about the Frederick the Great if we need to. Here's Kant. Thus, his love for French literature also laid the way for the victory of the new French world of thought, which in its version of love in the form of teaching of humanitarianism crippled the organic powers of Prussia that had still not awoken to full consciousness. This made it incapable of resisting the armies of the French Revolution. So basically what he's talking about is Frederick Wilhelm II is betraying his father, Frederick Wilhelm I. So Frederick the Great gets betrayed by his son because his son is a lover of French literature. The French literature teaches him humanitarianism, and humanitarianism rots the German, or the Prussian, I should say, soul, and the Prussian rotted soul can't resist the French Revolution, so that which he turns to Jews and Freemasons. This new doctrine of humanitarianism was the religion of the Freemasons. This is what he says. The latter has provided up to the present the spiritual foundations of an abstract universalistic culture, the starting point of all self-seeking sermons promising bliss. It also gave around the year 1740, the stamp to the political slogans of the last 150 years: liberty, equality, and fraternity, and it gave birth to chaotic, racially decomposing, quote, humane democracy. So he's laying the changes in Europe that are of the shape of French Enlightenment, French liberalism, and the French Revolution at the feet of the Freemasons, founded in 1717, saying that they organized by 1740 into the slogans that rotted out Europe: liberty, equality, and fraternity, and this idea of a humane democracy that has a chaotic nature that is ultimately what? Racially decomposing. It says at a London assembly at the beginning of the 18th century, there's 1717 is the right year, men gathered whose conflict with the former religion of love, that's Christianity, had led in many cases to their exile from people and fatherland, and who in the midst of a dissolute time founded a league of mankind for the promotion of humanity and brotherhood. Since this league recognized only, quote, mankind, no racial or religious difference was made from the start. Okay, so he's claiming that basically people from all over Europe got kicked out of their countries. Britain was willing to absorb them. Notice that this is later, about 140 years later. Also the case with Karl Marx, who gets kicked out of like every European country, and London absorbs him. He's buried in London to this day. As people have seen, I visited his grave. It was a good time. Everybody knows what happened. If you don't, you should look it up. It's fantastic. But anyway, the Freemasons are formed by all these people who got kicked out of their different countries, their different fatherlands, in conflict with the former religion of love, it says, had formed a league. They came together in London, which wouldn't kick them out, promoting humanity and brotherhood. And this is the Freemasons. And this organization did not recognize race. No racial or religious differences were made from the start, and only recognized, quote, mankind. So this idea of a universal humanity and everything bad that follows from it, he blames on the Freemasons. Now, this is also what we hear from the woke right today, just to kind of point out this echo. Quote, it says, Masonry is a humanitarian league for the spreading of tolerant and humane principles, in the striving for which the Jew and Turk can have as great a share as a Christian. End quote. So ran the Constitution set up in 1722. The idea of humanitarianism was to form the principle, the purpose, and the substance of Freemasonry. It is, according to the Freiburg Ritual, more far-reaching than all churches, states, and schools, than all classes, peoples, and nationalities. It extends over the whole of mankind. The German Lodge teaches us the same even today. The Roman Church and the Freemasonic anti-church are thus united in tearing down all barriers that have been erected by spiritual and physical forms. Remember, spiritual form, race, soul, comes from race, physical form. So you got to remember that with this guy. He's a root race kind of fellow. Race and race soul are inextricably linked. And so the Roman Church and the Freemasonic anti-church share in common the desire to break down the barriers between races and race souls. In this idea of universal humanity, this is another form of love that is destroying the world in the Nazi mindset. It says both call upon their supporters in the name of love or humanity, in the name of a boundless universalism, except that the church demands complete subjection and subordination within its domain, which naturally is to be the entire earth. The anti-church, on the other hand, that's the Freemasonry Lodge, preaches an unrestricted destruction of frontiers and makes the suffering and joy of the individual man into the measure of its judgment. This must be regarded as the cause of the present situation, namely that the material well-being of the individual has become the highest good for democracy and receives first place from it in the life of society. I remind you, in the Doctrine of Fascism by Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile, they explain that the fascist life is a hard one without material comforts and benefits, and it's meant to be that way. So the fascist rejects this idea of material well-being being at the center. The society itself might be rich, but the individual is sacrificing in honor and duty to the society at large. So the individual will suffer and have a Spartan and not threadbare necessarily, austere life. This disintegrating worldview, that's how he describes. So this idea of material well-being, a better standard of living, rising standard of living, individual people being well off, a rising middle class, is a disintegrating worldview in his idea. This idea of a universal humanity, this idea of people being fundamentally human at the end of the day, this idea of people being image bearers of God, of the one God. These ideas he calls a disintegrating worldview. This disintegrating worldview was and is the prerequisite for the political teaching of democracy and of the coercive dogma of the necessity of the free interplay of forces. Thus, all the forces that work for the loosening of state, national, and social bonds necessarily made effort to render themselves of service to this philosophy of Freemasonry, and consequently also to the League of Mankind. Here we see international Jewry worming its way from instinct coupled with conscious reflection into the organization of Freemasonry. So international Jewry wormed its way into the Freemasons, he says, and basically took control of it and used it to do Jewish things to the world that are apparently bad, rooted in the idea of humanitarianism, which is an expression of love and universal dignity of people, which the racialist worldview of the Nazis must reject. The myth of the blood fundamentally rejects. Admittedly, he says, the racial essence in the League of Mankind reacted just as defensively against the attempt by the Church to exterminate Germanic nature, but it nevertheless easily proved that while Nordic man defended himself against Rome, the blind Hodor, that's a blind god of Norse mythology, unwittingly gave him the death blow from behind. Freemasonry in Italy, France, and England became a political league of men and led the democratic revolutions of the 19th century. Year by year, its world outlook undermined the bases of all Germanic nature. Now, there are strong reasons to believe that this Masonic idea was actually part of the American founding as well, and the revolutions of the 19th century are certainly, well, it was actually the late 18th century, are going to be kind of included here. And this is so the American Revolution, the point I'm making is the American Revolution is anti-German, according to the Nazis. And so America is anti-Nazi. And I think that we should try to remember that. The Nazis are not a solution to America. They are the death of America. That is not the way out. That's the point of the Nazi Experiment podcast series. He says, today we see the busy representatives of the international stock exchange and of world trade moving almost everywhere behind the leadership of the anti-church. So you have an international Jewry Freemason conglomeration that's controlling the international finance markets. Sounds like a conspiracy theory that we're familiar with again today. And all in the name of humanitarianism, he says. So, I mean, like ESG, right? The history's rhyming. The hypocrisy of the present-day exploiters of humanity is without question more degrading than those attempts at slavery, which in the name of Christian love has so often plunged Europe into unrest and chaos. Thanks to the preaching of humanitarianism and the doctrine of human equality, every Jew, Negro, and mulatto can become a citizen of equal rights in a European state. Thanks to the humanitarian concern for the individual, there are hosts of luxury institutions for the incurably sick and insane in the European states. Thanks to humanitarianism, the confirmed criminal is regarded as merely an unfortunate, without any concern for the interests of the people as a whole, is let loose again into society at the first opportunity and not hindered in his capacity of reproduction. In the name of humanity and freedom of spirit, the pornographic journalist and every dishonorable scoundrel is allowed to trade in every imaginable brothel literature. Thanks to humanity, Negroes and Jews may marry into the Nordic race, indeed even occupy important offices. All right, so the woke right basically embodies this paragraph. This is history rhyming again, very, 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 very clearly. So let's kind of look at that again. This is what has plunged Europe into unrest and chaos. But what do we have? Let's go through. Thanks to the preaching of humanitarianism and the doctrine of human equality, what do we get? Jews, Negroes, and mulattoes can become citizens of equal rights. Same thing, because of their concern for the individual and individual rights, there are hosts of luxury institutions for the incurably sick and insane. This is an issue we're looking at today because of the woke, not because of real humanitarian concern. You could say that it is a humanitarian principle, but run amok. It says, thanks to humanitarianism, the confirmed criminal is merely regarded as an unfortunate. This is the reason that this ideology is appealing to our young people is this list of things that he was mad about in 1930 are a list of things that we're rightly mad about today. It's the same stuff, and in many cases for the same reasons. Not that his diagnosis is correct, but thanks to humanitarianism, he says, is the reason. It's actually thanks to putting humanitarian empathy above basic necessity and common sense that's the problem. Common sense says not to do any of this, but now we're talking about the confirmed criminal is regarded as merely an unfortunate, and there's no concerns to the interests of the people as a whole. Like, is it dangerous to have criminals out there? No, he's just unfortunate, so just let him back out as soon as possible and let him make as many babies as he wants as a criminal. And then because of this idea also of humanity and freedom of spirit, which is not the kind of freedom that they talk about. It's a different freedom from the German honor duty-bound freedom. Because of individual freedom, the pornographic journalists, remember the Jews allegedly are creating all the porn? That's what we hear. Pornographic journalists and every dishonorable scoundrel is allowed to trade in every imaginable brothel literature. And also, we can have miscegenation. Negroes and Jews may marry into the Nordic race and even occupy important offices. That's the list of complaints. History is rhyming. It's important that we understand that this is a core part of the Nazi experiment, and the Nazi experiment was a failure to deal with these concerns in the grandest sense. This humanitarianism, he tells us, unconnected with any racial concept of honor, has, among others, made the indescribably corrupt system of stock exchange swindling into a respected profession. Sounds like things we hear from woke left and right today. Indeed, this organized band of criminals in frock coats and top hats today, working through world trade and expert conferences, exercises autocratic rule over the fate of millions of hardworking people. This is a message that would be, if properly framed, very appealing to MAGA, talking about Davos. In the wake of this Freemasonic democracy swindle, he tells us, the entire Marxist movement falsified the beginnings of a healthy protest by the workers and controlled all social democratic parties in the service of the stock exchange with the aid of Jewish finance, Jewish leaders, and Jewish partly individualistic and partly universalistic ideology. The industrial worker, this sounds like exactly the propaganda we're facing today. The industrial worker of the 19th century, cheated out of his destiny, sounds like today, suddenly uprooted, robbed of all balanced judgment, fled to the alluring preachments of a proletarian international, believed that by class struggle, that is, by the destruction of half his own body, he would be able to become free. He intoxicated himself with the power attained and poured a whitewash of humanism over this. Today, this delusion, woke for us, has burst, and the Marxist leadership has been unmasked as perpetrating a frightful swindle on a hard, struggling class. This is the situation we find ourselves in. This is the situation that Rosenberg was selling his poison to, and this is the reason that the similar poison today is selling to our young people. He says the paradox of both democracy and Marxist doctrine consists in that they both actually represent the most brutal, dishonorable, materialistic worldview and consciously foster all impulses that will aid decomposition. But that's racial decomposition, by the way. But at the same time give assurances of their mercifulness, of their love for the subjected and exploited. In a clever way, both call upon the readiness for spiritual sacrifice by the proletariat to make them inwardly dependent on its leaders. We see in Marxism the idea of sacrifice and of love playing the same role as in the Roman Catholic system. Blood and honor were likewise mocked and derided by the leaders of Marxism until, however, these indestructible ideas nevertheless revealed themselves in the workers. Today there is at least talk of, quote, proletarian honor. If this idea spreads, then everything is still not lost. For with the holding aloft of the idea of honor in general, the German working class will also know how to rid itself once and for all of its Marxist leadership. If this idea of class honor then evolves into that of national honor, then German freedom will be secured as a result. Another way to put that is, if this idea of class struggle or class identification or class consciousness, if this idea of class consciousness evolves into nationalist collectivist consciousness, then German freedom will be secured as a result. This is the change from woke left to woke right that I've been describing for a few years that people find hard to understand. And then he says, but this is only possible when all real German workers form a united front against all those who have sold themselves to trade, profit, and the stock exchange. Sounds pretty much like he's pushing a socialist concept, guys. Irrespective of whether this fact is covered with the cloak of democracy, Christianity, internationalism, or humanitarianism. So there's a few more paragraphs, but I'm not going to read them in that section. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this last section because now we've talked about love, brotherly love, agape, charity, pity in the Christian sense, on all of those things. Now we've talked about this idea of humanitarianism and the equality of men. These are the things that are tearing apart the German Nordic ideal. These are the antithesis of the German honor-based culture that he's trying to sell to people as a solution to the malaise of the day. And now he's going to turn to one more possible path, which is basically sympathy. One more way you can have love. And he's going to characterize it in the Russian worldview. So he's going to distinguish the German from the Russian. And the section is titled Dostoevsky and the Russian Worldview. And he says the humility of the Christian church and Freemasonic humanitarianism were two forms by which the idea of love was preached as the highest valued human groups, who were to be directed from some ambitious center of power. So there are both ways of stealing power, by the way. The fact that many teachers of Christian humility, as well as liberal humanism, had no such intention did not play any role at all. It is merely a question of how the value proclaimed was utilized. So again, he's saying the people that sell you love don't really believe in love. They're selling it to you in order to use you for power, and it's fake. At the end of the 19th century, he says the idea of love appeared in a third form, which was presented to us by Bolshevism. So this is the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party of Russia, in the Russian doctrine of suffering and sympathy symbolized in the Dostoevskian man. Okay, so I want to point out that Marx even said that it's through suffering that man comes to consciousness. Not a ton I'm going to read from this section, but just enough. In his diary, Dostoevsky speaks quite openly of an absolute, deeply rooted longing among Russians for suffering, for continual suffering, suffering in everything, even in enjoyment. On the basis of this, his characters act and live. Therefore, in sympathy also lies the strong point of Russian morality. Because they suffer, we can be sympathetic. The people know that a criminal acts sinfully, but, quote, there are unexpressed ideas. The description of a criminal as an unfortunate must be included in these ideas, which are inherent in the Russian people, end quote. I don't know who he's quoting, it doesn't say. This idea is purely a Russian one. I'm assuming he's quoting Dostoevsky here. Dostoevsky is the magnifying glass of the Russian soul, he says. Through his personality, one can read the whole of Russia in its often incomprehensible diversity. In fact, the conclusions he draws from his confession of belief are just as characteristic as his reflections when judging the condition of the Russian soul. He remarked that this idea of suffering is closely linked with traits of the impersonal and subjected. Russian suicide, for example, has not a shadow of doubt that the self to be killed could be an immortal one. At the same time, Dostoevsky is not an atheist in any way. He has apparently heard nothing at all about this. Quote, "Consider the earlier atheists. When they had lost faith in one thing, they immediately began to believe passionately in another. Consider the beliefs of Diderot, Voltaire, completely tabula rasa with ours," end quote. Indeed, why make mention of Voltaire here? There is simply a lack of money to keep a lover to himself and nothing more. To find this recognition existing in a man who only wished to live to one day see his people happy and educated is alarming. It's made greater by Dostoevsky's remark that in Russia there is no one who does not tell lies. In fact, the most honorable people of all can lie. First of all, because truth seems to bore a Russian, but secondly, because we are all ashamed of ourselves, and each makes efforts to unconditionally show himself as something other than he is. And despite all longing for knowledge and truth, the Russian is nevertheless badly equipped. But here, the reverse side of subjugation is revealed: unbounded arrogance. So I want to remind you, now that he's describing the Russian soul, that the Russian soul is a racial soul in his worldview. It is an extension of his race. So he's going to describe the Russian soul as degraded, as having degraded because of racial degradation, and that the result of this is that they became susceptible to and conduits for Bolshevism. That was the point of the section, if you remember the beginning. This is all how we get to Bolshevism, which is the installation, the forceful political installation of communism. Marxism would not, as much as he's complained about it, would not be on the map had it not been for the Bolsheviks. And so he talks a lot. This is actually a very long section that's very literate. He's very familiar with Dostoevsky and his writing. And I'm trying to scoot down here while I ramble to get to the point where he's talking about where you end up with the Bolsheviks. So I'll start, I think I maybe am missing part of this. From now on, everything that was sick, broken, and decayed was held to be human. The humbled and persecuted became heroes. The epileptics were represented as being problems of deep concern to mankind, as unassailable as the decaying holy beggars of the Middle Ages or simian stylites. By this, the conception of Germanic man was transformed into its opposite. What the West regards as human is a hero like Achilles or the creative struggling of Faust. Human is a power like the untiring Leonardo. Human is a struggle such as Richard Wagner and Frederick the Great embodied. A clearing out must be performed once and for all of this Russian disease of representing criminals as unfortunates and rotten, decayed men as symbols of humanity. Even the Indian, he says, upon whom many Russians call in a false way, accepts his fate as self-guilt, as guilt from an earlier life. In whatever manner one interprets this Indian doctrine of the migration of souls, it is aristocratic and it once originated from a courageous heart. But Dostoevskian lamentation about the power of darkness is the helpless stammering of a poisoned blood. So the Russian problem is poisoned blood. This decayed blood created its highest value in the longing for suffering and humility in universal human love and became hostile to nature as triumphant Rome once did until Europe managed to shake off this aesthetic Egyptian African masochism. It is ill-fated that today, and of course what caused all this, by the way, the Russian Orthodox Church taking over their society, just to point that out. It is ill-fated that today ancient Greek love is described by the same word eros as in so-called Christian teaching, and Dostoevsky and Plato are even mentioned in the same breath. The eros of Greece was a spiritual exuberance linked always with creative feelings for nature, and the divine Plato is a completely different figure that represented and the divine Plato is a completely different figure from that presented to us by theologians and professors. From Homer to Plato, nature and love have been one, just as the highest art in Hellas remained racially connected. But church love set itself up not only against all ideas of race and people, but it went even beyond this. Zeno the Holy said in the 4th century AD, quote, "The greatest renown of Christian virtue is to trample with the feet upon nature," end quote. The church has faithfully followed this dogma wherever it could assert it. The insulting of the body as unclean has lasted uninterrupted into our days, when nationalism and the racial idea are combated as pagan. The imitation of Jesus, to attain which the devout rolled themselves in ashes, beat themselves with whips, went about in pus and sores, loaded themselves with iron chains, sat on a pillar for 30 years like Simeon Stylites, or like, it's probably Stylites actually, Simeon Stylites, or the holy Thalileos, spent 10 years clamped inside a wagon wheel to pass the remainder of his life in a narrow cage. All this was a parallel to the abstract good of Socrates and to the later Dostoevskian man. It is not unnatural love, not an unrealizable community of the good and faithful, not a universal humanity with decomposed blood, which has always had a creative effect in culture and art, but as in Hellas, fruitful eros and racial beauty, and in Germania, honor and the dynamic of race. Whoever regards these laws is incapable of showing the way to a strong future for the Germanic West. So notice that he says that the Christian problem, and it's manifests strongly in Russia, is the trampling of nature, the trampling of the human spirit, and particularly the trampling of erotic love. So we're reminded that here in 1930, he's writing this. In 1955, Herbert Marcuse, the arch critical theorist of the Frankfurt School, is writing Eros and Civilization and making roughly the same point, that the reason we don't believe in a socialism is because we've suppressed our erotic libidos and turned them into productive work under the Protestant work ethic. This is the same thing he's actually criticizing in the Russian and in the actual European under the churches, as being indicative of a weakened, poisoned, degraded, decomposed people and blood. With Dostoevsky, remember in the previous part, he actually said that when you see these kinds of societal sicknesses, you know that it proves that there was already decay in the blood, because the myth of the blood is that the blood is indicative of character. Okay, so if you see things like these societal sicknesses as he diagnoses them, there must have been an earlier decay of the blood of the people themselves. So with Dostoevsky, he says one can virtually touch by hand his great holy will in its constant struggle with the forces of decline. While he praises Russian man as a signpost of the European future, he already sees Russia delivered up to demons. He knows in advance who will be master in the play of forces: unemployed lawyers and insolent Jews. Kerensky and Trotsky are predicted. In the year 1917, Russian man finally disintegrated. That's the year the Bolsheviks took over. He fell into two parts. The Nordic Russian blood gave up the struggle. The Eastern Mongolian, powerfully stirred up, summoned Chinese and desert peoples to its aid. Jews and Armenians pushed forward to leadership, and the Kalmuk Tartar Vladimir Lenin became master. The demonry of this blood directed itself instinctively against everything that outwardly still had some honest effect, looked manly and Nordic, like a living reproach against a type of man whom Lothrop Stoddard might rightly describe as the underman. Out of the impotent love of earlier times grew an epileptic attack, carried through politically with all the energy of the insane. Smerdyakov ruled over Russia. Regardless of how the Russian experiment may develop, Bolshevism as ruler has only been possible as a consequence of a racially and spiritually sick national body, one that could not decide in favor of honor, but only of bloodless love. So we get the communists because of love. The Bolshevik brutality, the Soviet Union, is a result of favoring love over honor. He says, whoever desires a new Germany will, as a result, also reject the Russian temptation, along with its Jewish manipulation. That, of course, is a conspiracy theory that doesn't bear in reality, but it's very popular now, very popular with the Nazis. He says, the turning away from the latter, meaning the Jewish manipulation, is already occurring, and the future will record the results. That's a perfect place to stop, because the future did record the results. The results were World War II and a fucking Holocaust. Like, you couldn't have got worse, actually. You really couldn't have got worse. Nuclear bombs in Japan. You literally couldn't have got worse. Okay, so history recorded the results. That's right, Alfred Rosenberg. It sure did. The world is turning away from Jewish manipulation. History will record the results. The results were a fucking Holocaust and the worst war that's ever been fought in the world, ending with nuclear fire on 2 Japanese cities. Let that sink in, as they say. History will record the results of the world is turning away from Jewish manipulation. Let it sink in, because that's what's going on now under this brand of anti-Zionism that we hear everywhere all the time. That Israel caused this problem, that Israel caused that problem, that Israel's losing the PR war. But if they do any PR, that's foreign manipulation. So that's bad PR for them. They can't fight the PR war because it's bad PR for them to fight the PR war. But if they don't fight it, they lose the PR war. This is straight up impossible double standards. This is only possible by the hatred of Jews that is being framed as rejecting and turning away from alleged Jewish manipulation that's not even real. The turning away from Jewish manipulation is already occurring, he says. The future will record the results. And it sure did. It sure fucking did, people. And this is why we say never again is now on so many of these podcasts. This is why this is such a crucial issue. So here we have a look into this comparison of love, as in giving a shit about people that aren't you or your race, and honor, which is not honor at all or honorable behavior, but sacrificing yourself in the name of supporting your racial folk at your own cost. That's how these things are actually defined. And the future will record the results of this experiment. And the results were us having to say never again. It's unfreaking believable this is happening again in the world. But this is what the myth of the blood, this is what this pseudoscientific desperate grasp to redefine themselves as Germans after World War I and after the entirety of the 19th century, this is what it led to. And this is why it's so urgent that we understand what these crazy people believed, not in the superficial way that we learned maybe in high school or that we picked up here and there, not even in the way where we've read the stories of the Holocaust, or we've been to the museums, we've been to Yad Vashem or some equivalent somewhere else in the world. Not like that. Like, we actually get inside these people's heads and see that they were demented, that they believed crazy stuff, that they adopted pseudoscientific views in a desperate attempt to regain national identity, and did some of the worst things based on the worst beliefs in the history of mankind, and that we could go there too, and people are trying to take us there, and we must resist that temptation. We must resist that direction. We must pull our young people, our veterans, our apparently crazy white women, etc., back from the brink, and not let them go into this very dark, very ugly situation. So I don't plan to end most of the episodes of the Myth of the Blood series with it, but here it fits. The future will record the results, says Alfred Rosenberg, of turning away from alleged Jewish manipulation that's not even real, and the claim that it's subverting all of our values, and it sure did. And because the future did record the results of that, and because we're being tempted into it again, we say it again. Never again means never, and never again means now.